Billionaire investor forces a black waitress to create art to humiliate her. But what happens next will leave him speechless. What started as an attempt to break her turned into a moment that shattered his arrogance. Keep watching to see how a simple challenge becomes a life-changing revelation. Maria had worked countless hours in this rundown restaurant, serving plates to rich men who never even looked at her. But today something changed. Today, the very man who thought he could buy anything, everything, was about to meet the one thing he couldn't control: her talent. Maria's shift had just begun, the familiar clink of silverware and the hum of conversation filling the air. She wasn't new to this place. Far from it. She knew every creak of the floorboards, every squeak of the back door, and every passing glance from a customer who assumed she was nothing more than the waitress handing them their food. She had heard the whispers, the underestimation, the dismissals, but today something was different. As she walked to the dining area, a group of well-dressed men sat at the corner booth, their laughter echoing through the restaurant. One man stood out, as he always did, the billionaire investor, well known for his wealth and arrogance. He had a way of walking into a room like he owned it, and the way he sneered at the waitress when she approached only confirmed it. "Bring me your finest wine, girl," he said, barely glancing up, "and something extravagant to eat. I'll pay for quality, unlike the rest of these people." Maria's jaw tightened. She had heard it all before. The way some people treated her, like she was invisible, just a servant. But she forced a smile, nodded, and went to grab his order. Inside, though, she was fuming. Every word from him felt like a slap in the face. Every assumption about her was like a burden she was forced to carry silently. But this time was different. As she returned with his order, he looked her up and down dismissively. "You know," he said with a smirk, "I can tell that you've got no talent beyond carrying plates. I bet you can't even do something interesting, like draw or paint. Not that it matters. Why don't you show us what you got, huh?" He looked at her like she was nothing more than a joke. His friends chuckled along with him. The challenge hit her like a slap. It was designed to humiliate, to mock her in front of everyone. She had been dismissed, reduced to nothing more than a background player in their world. But she didn't say anything. Instead, she smiled thinly and, without a word, walked to the counter. Maria's mind raced. Draw, paint. What did he think she was? Some puppet for his entertainment. But then she stopped. Something inside her stirred, something that had been buried for too long. This man had no idea who he was dealing with. He thought he could dismiss her, think her incapable of anything more than what he saw in front of him. He thought he could break her, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Without even thinking, she grabbed a napkin and a pen from the nearby counter. She could hear the snickers from his table, but she didn't care. She started drawing. At first, it was just a few lines. But then, as her hand moved, the shapes began to take form. The world around her melted away. The clinking of dishes, the murmurs of other customers, and even the mocking laughter at her expense. She was in her own world now, and with each stroke, the anger and hurt began to fade. She was no longer just Maria the waitress. She was Maria the artist. Maria stood frozen for a moment, staring down at the napkin in her hand, her fingers gripping the pen tightly. The laughter from the billionaire's table echoed in her ears, but her heart was racing. This was more than just a challenge. It felt like a test of her worth, of her ability to prove that she was more than just a waitress. Should I do this? The thought lingered, but only for a second. Should I give him the satisfaction of watching me fail? But as she stood there with the eyes of the entire room now on her, something shifted inside. This wasn't about him. It was about her. For once, she didn't have to prove anything to anyone but herself. This was her moment. Taking a deep breath, she set the napkin on the table, placed the pen to the surface, and began to draw. At first, the lines were tentative, unsure, but with each stroke, she found herself letting go of the frustration that had built up over the years. With every curve of the pen, the pressure in her chest started to ease. Every line was a release. Every stroke was a battle against the assumptions people had made about her. She thought of the countless times she had been dismissed in her life, the way people looked at her when they saw her working, as if they thought she had no ambition, no talent. The times when she had been told that her dreams were unrealistic, that she should just be happy with what she had. She had always held back, always kept her true passions hidden, convinced that nobody would ever take her seriously. But now as she sketched, those doubts began to fade. The figure she was drawing began to take shape. A woman, strong and confident, standing tall in the face of everything that had tried to hold her down. This was her. She was painting her story, telling it in ways that words could never express. She glanced up briefly to see the billionaire watching her intently, his smirk gone, replaced by an expression of surprise. But he didn't say anything. He just watched, and that made her draw harder, faster. The pressure was on, but in that moment, the pressure became fuel. With each line, her confidence grew. She was no longer that quiet, unnoticed girl who had to smile through every insult and disrespect. She was a force, and the pen in her hand was her weapon, her statement. The table around the billionaire had gone quiet. Maria could hear the faint whispers, the soft murmurs of the others sitting nearby, and then a deeper silence began to settle over the room. No one was laughing anymore. She didn't look up, but she could feel it. The shift in the room. The energy had changed. People were no longer mocking her. They were waiting to see what she would create. For the first time in a long time, Maria felt powerful. Every stroke of the pen, every line on the napkin was her saying, "I'm not invisible. I'm not just here to serve you. I'm here to be seen. I matter." She could feel the billionaire's eyes on her, but now his presence didn't intimidate her. She was no longer the subject of his ridicule. She was showing him something he couldn't have predicted. She was showing him her worth. The billionaire shifted in his seat, his smugness faltering. His fingers drummed nervously on the table as he leaned in, watching the drawing take form. For the first time, his face wasn't filled with mockery, but with uncertainty. As Maria finished the last stroke, she set the pen down with a finality. Her chest heaved with a deep breath, and for a moment she just sat there, looking at the drawing. The room remained quiet, the tension in the air almost tangible. The billionaire, still staring at the artwork, looked as if he had lost his words. The people around the table, once so eager to laugh at her, were now silent, their eyes wide in disbelief. Maria stood up slowly, not waiting for anyone to speak. She picked up the napkin and folded it carefully, walking away from the table without a word. As Maria walked away from the table, the sound of her shoes on the floor was the only noise in the room. The once loud chatter had died down to a soft murmur, with every eye now on the napkin she had just left behind. People were leaning in, some craning their necks to get a better look at the artwork. It was as if they couldn't believe their eyes. There was no way that this waitress, this woman they had so easily dismissed, had just created something so extraordinary. The billionaire sat back in his chair, his smirk now completely gone. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a flicker of confusion. His eyes were fixed on the napkin in front of him, unable to look away. The lines she had drawn were far more than just a sketch. They were full of depth, emotion, and an artistry he hadn't expected from someone who served food for a living. Her strokes weren't just technical, they were alive. The way the figure on the napkin seemed to pulse with energy, the way each curve told a story, made it clear to everyone around the table that this wasn't just a random drawing. This was the work of someone who had been hiding her talent for far too long. And as the drawing slowly revealed itself, the people around him began to notice it too. The quiet whispers around the room grew louder, and slowly, a small crowd began to gather near the table. They watched in awe as the once derided waitress was now being seen as something entirely different. She wasn't just Maria the waitress anymore. She was Maria the artist. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, betraying his nervousness. His sharp, judgmental eyes, those eyes that had once seen her as nothing more than a lowly servant, were now wide with disbelief. He had never expected this. He had expected to see her falter, perhaps even stutter or fail. But what he was seeing instead was talent, pure, raw talent. Something that threatened to challenge everything he had believed about people like her. His thoughts raced. This can't be real. She's just a waitress. a servant. How could she be this good? But with each passing second, that belief was shattering, piece by piece. He had expected to humiliate her, to expose her for being what he had assumed, a person with no real value beyond the tips she earned from serving. But here she was, flipping the script and showing him that he was the one who had been wrong all along. The room had grown so quiet that Maria's soft breath seemed to echo around the space. As she stood back, she surveyed her work with quiet pride. She didn't need the validation of anyone in this room anymore. She had already proven her worth, to herself. But when her eyes briefly met the billionaire's, she saw something in his gaze she hadn't expected. Respect. It wasn't the kind of respect that came from charity or pity. It wasn't forced or fake. It was genuine, albeit too late. The same man who had dismissed her earlier now saw her for who she truly was. An artist, someone with a gift that had nothing to do with her position, her job, or the assumptions he had placed on her. But as the seconds stretched on, something shifted in the air. There was a heaviness in the room now, a realization that, no matter how impressed he was, it couldn't change what had just happened. He couldn't take back his earlier words. The damage was done, and the apology that might have been offered in a different time felt hollow now. The billionaire finally cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't expecting this." His words were quiet, almost reluctant, and they seemed to hang in the air like a confession. Maria, standing tall, glanced at him, but she said nothing. She didn't need to hear his apology. This moment wasn't about him. It was about her, her voice, her vision, her art, all the things that made her more than the job she held. The crowd had started to disperse, their murmurs softening as they returned to their own tables, leaving behind an almost eerie stillness in the restaurant. The billionaire, left alone with his thoughts, watched as Maria walked away from him, with her head held a little higher, her confidence a little stronger. He remained seated for a long while, still processing what had just happened. In the end, he had learned an uncomfortable truth. Maria wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a force, a talent that had been invisible to him until now. And for the first time, he felt a deep sense of regret. But Maria didn't wait for him to find the right words. She had already spoken with her actions. The tension in the restaurant had shifted. What started as a quiet, mocking challenge had turned into something much bigger. Maria stood tall, her heart still racing, but there was no more hesitation. The billionaire was sitting there, stunned, and the room was silent, waiting for her to say something. But she didn't. She didn't need to explain herself or wait for an apology. She had nothing left to prove to anyone but herself. The billionaire cleared his throat, trying to regain some sense of control. I wasn't expecting this," he muttered, finally breaking the silence. "I was just—" But Maria wasn't listening anymore. His words didn't matter. He had already made his assumptions, already tried to humiliate her. He didn't deserve an apology, and frankly, neither did she. He was just another man who thought his wealth could control everything. With a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, Maria turned away, her back straight. The damage was done. There was no undoing it. But the moment didn't belong to him anymore. Across the room, a few people had quietly gathered around, watching the scene unfold. Slowly, they began to clap, soft at first, but building into a loud, resounding applause. Maria's chest swelled with emotion, the overwhelming realization that she had not only silenced the mockery, but had turned it into something powerful, something she could hold on to. The billionaire's face was unreadable. He sat there, powerless, watching as the room turned against him. His arrogance, once so clear, had completely faltered. He wasn't in control anymore. Maria was. The applause kept growing, and Maria, who had once felt invisible, now stood at the center of it all, the weight of her own dignity and power lifting her higher. For the first time, she wasn't just seen as a waitress. She was an artist, and this was her moment. The billionaire stood up slowly, his face pale, his confidence shattered. He glanced around the room, the once adoring crowd now silent, staring at him with judgment. There was no apology, no attempt to save face. With a final, frustrated look, he turned on his heel and walked out of the restaurant, his footsteps echoing in the stillness behind him. The tension in the room dissolved the moment he left. The applause that had started quietly in the corner of the room grew into a full chorus, and Maria couldn't help but stand there, stunned. She had expected mockery, but instead, she had earned something much more powerful: respect. The other patrons, who had once been so eager to look down on her, now regarded her with a new understanding. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just a face behind a serving tray. In their eyes, she was someone with substance, someone who had stood her ground and proven her worth in front of a room full of people who had underestimated her. The world had shifted around her, and Maria realized that this moment was more than just a victory over one man. It was a declaration of her worth, her talent, and her refusal to be anyone's stereotype or punching bag. For the first time in her life, she felt seen for who she truly was. As the room began to settle, Maria stepped to the side, away from the crowd. She needed a moment to herself. She leaned against the back wall of the restaurant, taking a deep breath. The noise of the room faded into the background as her thoughts settled. She had come a long way from the young woman who once doubted herself. Today she had been tested, not by anyone else's standards, but by her own. She had been forced into a situation designed to break her, but instead, she had broken free from the limitations that had been placed on her. This wasn't just about the art. This was about standing up for who she was, even when the world around her tried to hold her down. Maria realized that she had always been more than just a waitress. She had always been an artist, a creator, and now more than ever, she understood that her worth could never be defined by others' expectations. As the restaurant returned to normal, with a hum of conversation and the clinking of dishes filling the air, Maria stood by the window, staring out at the city. The sun had set, and the world outside seemed quieter now, as if everything had calmed down after the storm. She thought back to earlier in the day, to the humiliation, the mockery, and the assumptions that had been placed on her. For so long, she had played the role of the invisible waitress, the one who was easily overlooked, easily dismissed. But today, she had done something different. Today, she had refused to be anyone's joke, anyone's target. Maria smiled to herself, a quiet pride swelling inside her. The applause, the respect. It wasn't just about proving the billionaire wrong. It was about proving something far more important to herself. She had fought for her dignity, for her talent, and she had earned her place in this world. No one could take that away from her. The lesson was clear. When you stand up for your worth, when you refuse to let anyone degrade you or define you by their narrow view, you open the door to something far more powerful than just validation. You open the door to respect. True respect isn't given out of pity or charity. It's earned through action, through standing firm in your truth, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult it may be. Maria had learned that today, and as she looked around at the restaurant, at the people who had once looked down on her, she knew that her life had shifted. She wasn't the same woman who had walked in this morning. She had found her voice. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand up for yourself, where the world tried to tell you who you were? Share your story in the comments below. And remember, your worth isn't defined by anyone else's assumptions. It's defined by you and how you stand up for it. If you believe in standing up for what's right and showing the world your true worth, hit that like button and subscribe for more empowering stories like this one.